The first thing I noticed wasn't what I saw. It was what I heard. Or more accurately, what I didn't hear. I've lived on that piece of land outside Millstone Creek, Arkansas, for almost 25 years. And when you spend that long in one place, you get used to its sounds the same way you get used to your own heartbeat. You don't notice them until they're gone. I pull my truck into the driveway just after noon on a Tuesday, coming back from a 3-day fishing trip with my cousin Nate up near the Oklahoma border. I was tired, sunburned, smelling like lake water and gasoline, looking forward to a cold shower and absolutely nothing else. Then I shut off the engine, and everything felt wrong. No rustling, no birds, no wind breaking through the tree line. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes the back of your neck tighten before your brain catches up. I stepped out of the truck and looked toward the western edge of my property. At first, I honestly couldn't process what I was seeing. There was too much sunlight. That sounds strange, I know, but sunlight was the first clue. That side of my ranch was always shaded by a row of towering cedar trees. 21 of them. Thick trunks, dense branches. The kind of trees that take decades to become part of the landscape. Only now there was nothing there. Just stumps. Fresh stumps. Rows of them. The exposed wood still pale and wet. Sawdust scattered across the dirt. And the smell, that sharp smell of freshly cut cedar hanging in the summer air. I remember standing there completely frozen, my truck door still open, one hand resting on the frame, just staring, because your mind doesn't immediately accept that something you've looked at every day for 20 years can suddenly vanish. You keep expecting your eyes to correct themselves. Maybe you're looking at the wrong spot. Maybe you're tired. Maybe there's some explanation you haven't seen yet. But there wasn't. Someone had cut down every single tree, all 21 of them. Then I noticed the envelope, bright white, taped directly to my front gate. The logo printed in the corner told me everything before I even opened it. Oak Hollow Community Association, the HOA. I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, because deep down, I already knew whose fingerprints were on this. I opened the envelope right there in the driveway. The letter was full of legal language, corporate politeness, and the kind of fake concern people use when they're trying to justify something they know they shouldn't have done. According to the board, the trees represented an immediate safety concern, potential wildfire risk, visibility obstruction, community protection, a bunch of words carefully arranged to sound responsible. At the bottom was an offer, $3,000. As compensation, $3,000 for 21 mature cedar trees. I stared at that number for a long moment before shaking my head. Then I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and looked toward the hill behind my property. And there it was. The reason, the motive, the entire explanation sitting in plain sight. A giant glass house overlooking the valley, belonging to Heather Langford, president of the HOA. Now, to understand Heather, you need to understand something about certain people. Some folks buy a house because they want a home. Others buy a house because they want a stage. Heather was the second kind. She loved attention, loved control, loved reminding everyone that she was president of the association whenever a disagreement happened. For years, she complained about those trees. Not directly, never directly. People like Heather are smarter than that. She'd make little comments at neighborhood cookouts. Such a shame that beautiful valley view gets blocked. Those trees sure have gotten tall. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone could enjoy the scenery? Little comments, tiny tests, seeing how much ground she could take without anyone pushing back. I always ignored her, because the trees weren't hers. They were on my land. I planted every one of them after my divorce. Back when the property was mostly dirt, broken fencing, and a guy trying to figure out what the rest of his life was supposed to look like. I dug those holes myself. Watered those saplings every morning before work. Watched them survive droughts, ice storms, tornado warnings, and summers hot enough to cook eggs on the hood of a truck. Those trees weren't landscaping. They were history, and now they were gone. I should have been furious. Maybe part of me was. But something else happened instead. Something colder, calmer. The kind of feeling you get when you realize somebody has made a mistake so big they just don't know it yet. I walked into the house, set my fishing gear down, grabbed my camera from the hallway cabinet, and headed back outside. Because one thing I've learned over the years is simple. Anger fades. Evidence doesn't. And standing there among 21 fresh stumps baking beneath the Arkansas sun, I had a feeling this story wasn't going to end with trees. Not even close. What I didn't know yet was that within a few weeks, Heather Langford was going to hand me enough evidence to destroy her own career, bankrupt the HOA she controlled, and turn an argument about trees into the most expensive mistake anyone in Oak Hollow had ever seen. The next morning, I started building a timeline. Not because I had some brilliant legal strategy already mapped out, but because I knew one thing for certain. People can argue opinions all day long, but paperwork has a funny way of exposing the truth. I spent nearly 6 hours walking the property line. Every stump got photographed from multiple angles. I took wide shots showing the location relative to the fence. Close-ups showing fresh cuts. Pictures of tire tracks. Pictures of sawdust piles. Even pictures of shadows. Some people might think that's excessive. Maybe it is. But when you've spent years working around contractors, surveyors, and county inspectors, you learn that details have a way of becoming important later. Around lunchtime, my neighbor Earl drove up on his old ATV. Earl was in his 70s, permanently sunburned, and had the kind of face that looked disappointed in humanity before you even started talking. He parked near the fence and stared at the stumps for a long time. Then he shook his head. "Well," he said, "that's one hell of a mess." I nodded. "Sure is." He looked toward Heather's house, sitting on the hill, then back at me. "You know, she had folks over Saturday night." That got my attention. "What kind of folks?" "Board members mostly." I waited. Earl scratched his beard. Saw them on the deck. Heard some laughing. Heather was saying something about finally getting her valley view back. There it was. Not proof. Not yet. But motive. And motive matters. Especially when somebody starts pretending they acted for public safety. By 3 that afternoon, I was sitting across from an attorney named Claire Donovan. Her office sat above an old insurance agency in downtown Millstone. Nothing fancy. Worn carpet. Coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. But Claire had the kind of calm confidence that made me trust her immediately. She didn't interrupt. Didn't overreact. Didn't start promising giant settlements. She just listened. When I finished telling the story, she looked through the HOA letter, reviewed my property survey, and spent several minutes studying maps in complete silence. Finally, she looked up. "Do you still have your original purchase documents?" "Every page." "Good." Then she smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile mechanics get when they discover the engine problem is much worse than expected. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I think your HOA may have trespassed 21 separate times." That single word changed everything. Trespass. Up until then, I'd viewed the situation as a dispute, a disagreement, an abuse of authority. But trespass was different. Trespass meant they crossed a legal boundary. Knowingly, deliberately. Claire spent the next hour comparing HOA maps against county records. Halfway through, she leaned back in her chair. "Oh, wow." I remember sitting up straighter. "What?" She tapped the survey. "The emergency authority, their citing only applies to common areas." "What does that mean?" "It means they had authority over walking paths, community landscaping, recreational zones, things like that." She pointed directly at my property line. "They had absolutely no authority over this land." None. None. Then things got worse. For them. A lot worse. Claire started asking questions about the age of the trees. Their species. Their approximate diameter. She pulled up county environmental ordinances and spent several minutes reading. Then she slowly turned the monitor toward me. "You might want to sit down for this." According to county regulations, any mature cedar exceeding specific trunk measurements qualified for protected preservation status under local environmental guidelines. 17 of my 21 trees qualified. Removing them required permits, reviews, documentation, none of which existed. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the situation had become so absurd my brain didn't know what else to do. Heather thought she'd removed a visual inconvenience. Instead, she'd potentially triggered environmental violations, property damage claims, trespass liability, and civil penalties. All because she wanted a better view. Claire immediately began preparing preservation notices and legal demands. Contractor records, board communications, internal correspondence, everything. And that's when Heather made the mistake that truly doomed her. She couldn't stay quiet. 3 days after the HOA received notice from Claire's office, my phone rang while I was standing inside a farm supply store buying feed. Heather. I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded warm, friendly, almost concerned, the way a snake probably sounds before it bites you. Daniel, she said, I hate how ugly this situation has become. I didn't say anything. Silence is powerful. Most dishonest people rush to fill it. Heather was no exception. She started talking about community responsibility, leadership burdens, fire hazards, neighborhood protection. Every excuse she'd probably rehearsed in front of a mirror. Then she said something that made me close my eyes. Something so unbelievably stupid that I nearly laughed right there in the store. Honestly, she said, we waited until you were out of town because we knew you'd react emotionally if you were present. For a moment, I just stood there holding a 50-pound bag of livestock feed. Then I asked the most important question of the entire conversation. Would you mind putting that explanation in writing? A pause. Then she answered, of course. 2 hours later, an email arrived, and it was glorious. Heather explained everything. The board discussions, the concerns about the view, the scheduling decisions, the contractor arrangements. She even acknowledged they intentionally performed the removal while I was away. When Claire read the email, she actually laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine laugh. Then she looked at me and said, I've represented people for almost 20 years. I have never seen someone volunteer this much evidence against themselves. But the avalanche was just beginning, because next came the contractor records. The tree company folded almost immediately once legal pressure arrived. They weren't interested in protecting the HOA. They wanted to protect themselves. Invoices, work orders, crew reports, internal notes. Everything got turned over. Buried inside the packet was a handwritten notation from the crew supervisor. Heather, present at site, confirmed removal instructions personally at 6:07 a.m. Claire slid the document across her desk. I read it twice, then a third time. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she broke the silence. You understand this isn't really about trees anymore. I nodded, because she was right. The trees had become evidence. The real issue was power. Heather believed her position made her untouchable. She believed rules were flexible when they inconvenienced her. And the deeper we dug, the worse things became. Discovery requests, uncovered emails, meeting notes, draft discussions. Then, about 3 weeks later, Claire called me and asked me to come into her office immediately. No explanation, just immediately. When I arrived, she was sitting at the conference table with a stack of printed documents. She looked excited, which is generally either very good news or very bad news when you're talking to a lawyer. What happened? I asked. Without saying a word, she handed me several pages. Internal HOA text messages. Messages recovered from board members during discovery. I started reading, and about halfway down the second page, my jaw actually dropped. There was Heather complaining repeatedly about losing her valley view. Heather demanding action. Heather pressuring board members. And then one message that practically set itself on fire. Find a violation. Use the fire code if you have to. I looked up. Claire was watching me. Neither of us needed to say anything, because from that moment forward, the case stopped being a legal fight. It became a countdown. The only question left wasn't whether Heather would lose. The only question was how much damage she'd cause herself before the final bill arrived. And as it turned out, that bill was going to be far larger than anyone in Oak Hollow could possibly imagine. By the time mediation arrived, the entire atmosphere around Oak Hollow had changed. People who used to smile at Heather during neighborhood barbecues suddenly avoided eye contact when she walked by. Neighbors who spent years agreeing with her every opinion were now claiming they had always disagreed with her leadership. Funny how that works. Consequences have a way of revealing where people's loyalties actually live. The mediation itself took place inside a county office building about 40 minutes from town. Nothing dramatic. No grand courtroom. No television cameras. Just a conference room, a long table, and a handful of people pretending there was still a reasonable path forward. Claire and I walked in carrying 3 binders and 2 flash drives. Heather arrived with the HOA attorney and 3 board members. She looked different, not defeated, not yet, but tired. The confidence was still there. The certainty wasn't. The HOA attorney opened with an offer. $95,000. Replacement landscaping. Attorney fees. Everything wrapped neatly inside a confidentiality agreement. In other words, they wanted the problem to disappear. Claire didn't even look at me. She simply pushed the paperwork back across the table. My client is not interested in helping you hide evidence. The room went silent. Heather folded her arms. Then she looked directly at me. Daniel, do you really want to destroy this community over a few trees? I remember staring at her for a moment because the question genuinely fascinated me. Even now, after everything we'd uncovered, she still saw herself as the victim. Still believed she had the moral high ground. Still believed authority gave her permission to rewrite reality. I leaned back in my chair. No, fíjate. My voice stayed calm. You destroyed trust in this community the morning you sent chainsaws onto private property. Nobody said anything after that. There wasn't much left to say, especially after Claire played her final card. The text messages. The moment those messages landed in front of the HOA attorney, I watched the man physically deflate. Years of legal experience couldn't save a client from her own words. Find a violation. Use the fire code if you have to. I want my view back. Every sentence painted the same picture. Premeditation, intent, abuse of authority. The mediation ended without an agreement. And honestly, I was relieved, because by that point, settlement felt wrong. Not because I wanted revenge, because some lessons become expensive precisely because they're important. 8 weeks later, we went to trial. The local newspaper covered it. Community social media groups exploded with arguments. Some people supported me. Others claimed I should have taken the money and moved on. The usual crowd insisted both sides were equally responsible, which always amazes me because apparently cutting down someone else's trees and objecting to having your trees cut down are now morally equivalent in some corners of the internet. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Old wood, cold air conditioning, the faint smell of stale coffee drifting in from the hallway. Claire built the case carefully, methodically. Property surveys, photographs, environmental reports, contractor statements, board communications, one piece at a time, like stacking bricks. The turning point came when the contractor's supervisor took the stand. He testified under oath that Heather personally approved the removals before sunrise. Then came the emails, then the text messages. Watching those messages read aloud in open court felt surreal. Because once words leave private conversations and enter public records, they change. They become permanent. Heather sat perfectly still while her own messages were projected onto a screen for everyone to see. The judge read several of them twice. That wasn't a good sign. The defense tried arguing community safety concerns. The judge dismantled that argument within minutes once the survey maps established the HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. From there, the outcome felt inevitable. 9 days later, the ruling arrived. Intentional trespass, property destruction, abuse of authority, environmental violations, full damages, attorney fees, additional penalties. The financial impact was devastating. The HOA's insurance carrier became involved. Emergency assessments were issued across the community. Heather was removed from her leadership position. Several board members resigned within weeks. The organization survived. Barely, but it would never look the same again. And neither would Heather. The question everyone always asks afterward is simple. What happened to the property? What happened to the trees? About 6 weeks after the judgment became final, I hired a landscape architect and an environmental consultant. Together, we designed something that probably made Heather's blood pressure spike every time she looked out her window. 38 new trees, different species, different growth patterns, layer heights, dense coverage, everything carefully planned. Every tree documented, surveyed, protected, registered through every preservation program available. If somebody ever wanted to remove those trees, They need permits, environmental reviews, hearings, approvals, paperwork, and a miracle. One afternoon while the crew was planting, Earl drove over with a cup of coffee and watched for a while. Then he grinned. "That's one hell of a privacy fence." I laughed. "No." He looked at me. "No." I shook my head. "This isn't a fence." "What is it then?" I watched another tree settle into the earth. Then I answered honestly. "It's a reminder. A reminder that property rights matter. A reminder that authority has limits. And maybe most importantly, a reminder that arrogance eventually sends the bill to the wrong address." The last thing I heard about Heather came about a year later. She sold a house, moved away. Some people said she couldn't stand looking at the replacement trees. Others said the community turned against her after the assessments hit everyone's wallets. I don't know which version is true. Maybe both. Why do know is this? I don't hate her. I really don't. Because over time, anger burns itself out. What remains is perspective. And the truth is, Heather taught me something valuable. Most people imagine justice as something dramatic. A big speech. A public humiliation. A perfect moment of revenge. But real justice usually looks different. It's paperwork, patience, evidence. One document at a time. One fact at a time. One consequence at a time. Until eventually the truth becomes too heavy for anyone to carry away. Today, the new trees are growing beautifully. They're not as tall as the originals yet, but they'll get there. And sometimes late at night, when the wind moves through those branches, the property sounds the way it used to, the way it should. And every now and then, I find myself wondering what other people would have done in my situation. Would you have taken the settlement and walked away? Would you have signed the confidentiality agreement and pocketed the money? Or would you have pushed all the way through court, knowing it would cost time, stress, and years of your life? Let me know down in the comments, because people get surprisingly divided about this story. And honestly, I can see both sides. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or a situation where power went too far. I'd love to hear your perspective, because sometimes the most interesting part of these stories isn't what happened. It's what you would have done differently.